For this video, I will be painting this mandala on a wooden pebble. To start off, I just put some guidelines on here, and I just always load up this first dot with a lot of paint. So anytime that I go back in, I don't push the tool all the way back down. I just kind of like tap it to the top of the dot, and that will help pull the paint off the tool, and it'll just kind of help build up that dot slowly without making it any larger. So just make it taller. And from there, I just start building out my mandala, and I am using metallic paints in this one, and these are Arteza paints that I took and thinned down with some pouring medium. So they are thicker paints, so when I do some of these bigger dots like these, you'll see me using a little needle. I do this because when I first make these dots, if you look closely, you can see that there is a little peak in the middle of the dot, and I'll just take that needle and just kind of swirl it around in the dot, and that will help even it out and smooth it out. And when the paint fully dries, it will leave you with like a nice rounded dots that will have like a lot of texture to it, and it will not have like any peaks or little sharp points in it. And that's just kind of how I prefer to make my dots. Now this gold paint is actually Liquitex gold with pouring medium as well, so it's still a thicker paint. I just really love this gold. It's one of my favorite ones to use, so I use it a lot. I also use like the golden version as well. Now for the design for the stone, when I paint, I like to just create as I go. So I really have no plan in mind. I usually always have my colors picked out. I know what colors I'm going to use. And most of my artwork, I'm usually only using like 2 to 3 colors. So in this one, it's just the dark blue, light blue, and gold, and that is it. Sometimes I will use a larger color palette, but for the most part, I just love the simplicity of these. I just love using just a couple of colors and just seeing all the different ways I can work with them. I decided that I did want to do some walking the dots with this one. This gold paint is just really beautiful with the little teeny dots, so I definitely wanted to work that in on this design. So the way it works with me when I create as I go is I'll just kind of make one decision, like I'm going to walk these dots in gold, and then I'll just kind of look at the space that I have left, and I'll start thinking of different ways I can fill in that space and what's going to work best visually. Also, I take into account like the color of paint that I need to use next to kind of like separate or define any areas. On this particular piece, I decided that I had enough room to do a swipe starting at the base of each of these dots and going up towards the top. And I had enough room to do that on both sides, and it would fill in that space very nicely. And it would also kind of like change the shape of the petals a little bit, making them a little bit wider at the base, which I really kind of wanted to do on this one. So that's why I made that decision. And then from here, I knew I wanted to bring in a lot more walking the dots on this piece. And part of that decision was based off the fact that this was a custom order, and they had ordered 2 stones. And their other stone, I did more swipes. So I knew I wanted to bring more walking the dots into this one. I wanted to make sure there was like a cohesiveness between the 2 stones, which is why I did add some swipes, but I also wanted to keep it where, you know, they both had their own style and their own uniqueness to them, but then they both look really nice sitting beside each other as well. At this point, I realized that the dark blue could get lost on this stone if I'm not too careful, so I decided to be sure to go around the dark blue with some light blue to kind of help define that area. One thing I also do a lot of when I am doing walking the dots is you notice that I will start walking the dots on one side of a petal, and I will just work my way around the mandala only doing that one side. This is something I've learned with time, that it's just kind of like a muscle memory thing. You kind of get in the groove of doing the dots on that one side, and when I would switch doing both sides as I work my way around, you're kind of switching from one motion to another, and I find that it's just easier for me and a lot faster, and it will give a better result doing just one side at a time on these smaller pieces. On a larger canvas, the amount of time you would spend moving the canvas is just too much. For this piece next, I decided to go in with some gold to kind of finish off this row of petals, and I decided to do swipes, and the main reason why is because I had done those swipes on that very first row in gold, so I thought this kind of would just bring it all together. I also just love the way this paint looks when you use it for swipes, so I thought it would just be like a nice little accent and just tying everything together. And then at this point, I'm starting to think about what I want to do for the next row and how I want to build it out. So again, I'll just look at the space that I've created and think about what would look best there. And I decided that I wanted to build out another section of petals, and I wanted it to be very similar to the first set of petals, but I'm going to make some changes along the way. So I put in that small light blue dot to kind of push that petal out more so that I have more room to walk the dots or do any swipes around this larger blue dot. And with this, the paint is thicker, so I will have to go in with a needle to kind of like just smooth all those dots out. And I really love the way the gold looked around the blue dot, so I brought that back in on this petal as well. And with these walking the dots, like I always really take my time on these, and that's what really helps with the spacing and making sure that they all end up looking symmetrical. The slower you go, the better. So I always make sure to just kind of slow down and really take my time anytime I'm walking the dots, and that always ends up giving me a better result in the end. Next, I'm already thinking about what I want to do for the next row, and looking at that next row, you can see like the dark blue does get a little lost, so I decided that I wanted to go in here with some light blue. That way I could really make sure that this color stood out. I also knew that I have a lot more room on this outside to do more rows of walking the dots if I wanted to. So I like the idea of going from like the light gold to the light blue and just kind of seeing how this petal would turn out. Again, here I just use the same tool going all the way around, and as I work my way around, I just have less and less paint on my tool, which will make those dots smaller and smaller. And all of these sections of walking the dots, it is really sped up. So I slowed it down some for you guys, but it is a very slow process. Next, I wanted to do the darker blue, but instead of doing the dots, I decided to do swipes. So the reason for this is that the swipe will stand out more and you won't lose the end of it as much as you do with the dots on the first petal in the dark blue. So I ended up making that change to make that a swipe. And then I wanted to go back in and do light blue around it. But for this, I am going to end up doing long walking the dots. So since these dots are large, I end up loading up that tool with like a lot of paint to make sure I can make it all the way around. And some of these I did have to go back in and just kind of swirl with the needle, especially like that first dot, just to make sure that they were going to dry all nice and smooth and rounded like I like. And then once I got here, I was like, I'm definitely going to start bringing in some of this gold. When I'm doing these dots on the sides, I have to do this little swirling motion to create these dots. This helps keep that peak at the top. And on these, I didn't have to go in and use the needle to kind of swirl and smooth them out because this paint's a little bit thinner than the Arteza. So the trick I've learned with this when I'm painting on the sides is just to do this swirling motion, and when I finish the swirl, I always finish it at the top of the dot, and then I'll just let gravity take a hold and it will bring that peak down to the center and leave me with a nice rounded dot once it's dry. So once I do these walking the dots, since it is an even longer line, you can see that I end up dipping my tool into the paint multiple times before I can get it to the end where I can just walk all the way around. So here I'm using like the larger end of this pink nail dotting tool, and I'll do about 2-3 dots on this one, and then I will just flip the tool over to the smaller end, and then I'm able to just walk the dots all the way down to the end. And I'm always just really paying close attention to the dot size and just making sure that each dot is just slowly getting smaller as I work my way around. I'm also looking at the space that I have between the two petals, and if I need to, I can make dots a little bit bigger on one side and smaller on the other to kind of make these spaces look more symmetrical. So it's all kind of like a game of just kind of tricking your eye and making it all look like it is just perfectly executed. But when you start to look very closely, you'll start to notice that some sections may have a little bit more room than others. And that's why I ended up making the decision to do swipes here, because I didn't have enough room to do a larger dot on all of these in the middle. So doing the swipes is another trick to kind of fill in that space very nicely. And I can make the swipes a little bit thinner or thicker depending on how much space I have. And I end up using just different tools to even create these swipes. So here I'm able to use like the pink tool, and on some of these I probably just even use just a needle to get that swipe all the way up. And then once I did that, I knew I wanted to go back in with some big blue dots on the sides. And on these, even though I'm doing a little swirling technique, I do go back with a needle to kind of just smooth out all of these dots to make sure that they're going to dry like nice and even. Next, once all of this paint is dry, I can go in and add top dots. So I decided to put like the lighter blue dot on top of all of the darker blue dots. And this ends up adding a lot of depth and ends up highlighting these dots. This is just the point where you really start to see the entire piece start to come together. And next I decided I was going to do one more layer of top dots. So once this first layer completely dried, I just go in and I lightened all the colors with a little bit of white, and I just go in and put another top dot on top of all of those, and that is how I painted this new stone. Please let me know your thoughts on this one below, and let me know what kind of videos you would like to see in the future. Thanks.